Russia's enormous arms industry has been the backbone of its economy and the driving force behind the war in Ukraine. Literally, trillions of dollars have been poured into it, and the industry enjoyed rapid, unprecedented growth for the first 3 years of the conflict. Now, however, it's starting to flatline, and even Russian banking officials and the government's own official statistics agency can't hide it. This is important because Russia has come to rely on its military-industrial complex in more ways than one. It obviously relies on it to supply the countless tanks, vehicles, drones and bombs that it launches into Ukraine day after day, night after night. But it also needs the complex to keep its economy from slipping into a dramatic and potentially inescapable recession. The industry has, in essence, become a sort of lifeboat for the Kremlin's economy, while other sectors across Russia, such as manufacturing, agriculture, mining and more, have struggled and slipped behind as the war raged on. The military industry managed to remain steady and stable for a long time, even experiencing rapid rates of growth at certain stages between 2022 and 2025. But countless experts and financial analysts knew that growth will not last forever. No country can rely solely on its military to power an entire economy, after all. And the first warning signs began to appear in the summer of 2025 at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, when the governor of Russia's central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, acknowledged that the country's financial resources were running low, and the nation's economy minister, Maxim Reshetnikov, confirmed that Russia was reaching the verge of a transition to recession. Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin agreed, explaining that many of the country's regional governors were struggling to fill their budgets, with business profits down, exports also down, and the economy on the whole in an increasingly dire and desperate state. Still, the country's president Vladimir Putin chose to push on with the war, announcing only the mildest of defense budget cuts for 2026, while vowing to keep fighting in Ukraine until Russia's objectives were achieved. The Kremlin even committed almost 40% of its entire federal budget to defense and law enforcement spending for 2026 and the years to follow. This narrow-minded, foolhardy commitment to conflict at the cost of almost everything else has inevitably pushed the Russian economy into an even more unstable state. Putin has chosen to walk a tightrope, going all in on the arms industry and hoping he'll be strong enough to keep his economy going as the war continues. But that tightrope is starting to fray, as shown in statistics compiled by Russian news outlet the Moscow Times and published in an October report entitled "The Economy Has Lost Its Last Slack. Military production in Russia has begun to decline." The report begins, "The military-industrial complex, which had become the main driver of the Russian economy thanks to trillions in budget spending on state defense orders, has unexpectedly faltered. For the first time since the war, industries related to the military-industrial complex have stagnated or contracted in production after nearly 3 years of double-digit growth, according to Rosstat data." Rosstat is the short name for Russia's Federal State Statistics Service, the governmental statistics agency that regularly publishes statistics related to numerous social, economic, demographic, and environmental processes across the country. Its September 2025 data showed some astonishing output declines in specific sectors related to the military-industrial complex. For example, the Moscow Times noted, "The production of finished metal products, which grew by 26.4% in 2023 and 31.6% in 2024, and was still showing a plus 21.2% increase in August, unexpectedly turned negative in September, down 1.6% year-on-year." That's a very sharp and sudden decline, but it's not the most damning stat from this report. Output in the other transport equipment category, for example, which specifically includes tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, saw its output drop even more dramatically, falling from 61.2% in August to only 6% in September. In other words, the numbers of tanks and other armored vehicles being produced in September were less than 10% of the totals for August. These figures are made to look even worse when compared to the previous 2 years, which saw growth rates of 29 and 34.2% respectively. Compared to August figures, production of finished metal products dropped by 6% overall, while other transport equipment collapsed by a shocking 20%. Analysts at the Russian Economic Statistics Analyst Group, MMI, described these figures as shocking, going on to note that the defense-related industrial sectors that had, prior to now, been helping to keep the Russian economy afloat were suddenly starting to drag it down. MMI added that Russia's broader manufacturing index managed to rise only 0.4% year-on-year in September, which is 8 times slower than the 2.4% increase reported in August. In short, all this data tells us one clear thing: Russia's arms industry is well and truly in decline, and that's a gigantic problem for the Russian economy, which has come to rely on its defense sector to stave off recession in recent weeks and months. The situation is so bad that even some of Russia's own high-ranking financial sector officials are sounding the alarm. Denis Popov, for example, who's the chief analyst at the state-owned PSB Bank, acknowledged that the manufacturing industry, the largest economic sector in all of Russia, experienced its weakest growth since early 2023. September's growth in manufacturing, the largest sector of the economy, was the lowest since early 2023. Moreover, growth continued to be observed in a limited number of industries: food and light industry, pharmaceutical production, and some mechanical engineering sectors. Overall, mechanical engineering, the main driver of manufacturing, showed no significant growth for the first time in a long period, minus 0.1% year-on-year in September, 7.8% year-on-year in Q3, and 9.2% year-on-year in January to September. And the data only gets worse from there. Russia's overall industrial output, which creates around 30% of the country's entire gross domestic product, GDP, has more or less flatlined, rising just 0.3% year-on-year in September 2025, compared to a much healthier figure of 5.6% in the previous year, with Popov concluding, industrial production, which accounts for approximately 30% of Russia's GDP, has virtually ceased growing. The weak positive dynamics are driven by growth in a limited number of sectors. We believe the risks of overcooling the Russian economy are very high, especially given the upcoming budget cuts in the fourth quarter. Analysts at the Russian TSMAKP Economic Development Agency have added to this grim assessment by noting that total industrial production has also dropped by 3.6% since December 2024. And civilian industries have seen their value and output shrink over the course of 2025, dropping by 1.1% by September compared to the start of the year. In the manufacturing sector alone, 18 out of 24, or 75% of all categories tracked by Rosstat, which account for around 80% of the country's entire industrial goods output, are officially in recession. And the machinery sector, which is extremely reliant on defense contracts dished out by the Russian government, also saw its numbers drop, witnessing a decline of 0.1% in September 2025, following a 15.7% year-on-year rise in August. The economy also faces a 21% drop in energy revenues, a deficit 5 times higher than expected, and a GDP that's going nowhere fast, with the Russian Academy of Science estimating that it shrank by 0.6% in the first half of 2025. Annual growth has almost entirely disappeared as well, reaching a meager total of only 0.4% through the summer months of July and August. The numbers paint a clear picture. Russia's arms industry is no longer the unstoppable force it once was, and cannot be counted on as some sort of immovable pillar for the Russian economy to lean on. It, like any other industry, is prone to periods of decline and loss. Now, here's a closer look at why this is all happening. And it's not just one reason, it's a whole myriad of factors, all intertwining and contributing to the Kremlin's economic chaos. Over in Russia, many financial experts feel that the industry's issues are closely linked to budget constraints. Natalia Orlova, for example, who is chief economist at Alfa Bank, fears that plans to tighten budget policy will impact industrial growth in the near future. While recent changes to the Russian budget are certainly a contributing factor to the economic crisis, there are several other elements that are likely having an even greater impact. 5 elements to be exact. The first and perhaps most obvious and impactful of all is the war itself. It's been an astonishingly costly conflict in every sense of the word, and Russia has lost jaw-dropping amounts of people, equipment, assets, and money. Despite pouring extravagant amounts of its national wealth fund and other war chest assets into its invasion, the Kremlin has so far failed to see the victories on the ground that it expected and imagined back in 2022, when the first Russian troops stepped onto Ukrainian soil. Instead, the nation has seen well over 1 million soldiers killed or wounded, along with thousands upon thousands of tanks, armored and infantry fighting vehicles, personnel carriers, artillery systems, mobility vehicles, anti-aircraft guns, air defense systems, radars, aircraft, helicopters, naval vessels, rocket launchers, and other assets either damaged or entirely destroyed. The costs related to those losses are incalculable. There are the enormous and spiraling recruitment costs, for example, with Russia being forced to offer increasingly higher cash incentives and military salaries to encourage able-bodied citizens to sign up and join the fight. Plus, the inevitable compensation costs paid out to their surviving families when so many of them inevitably lose their lives. There are the costs of procurement, production, maintenance, and repairs of all the vehicles, tanks, radars, fighter jets, bombers, missiles, drones, and air defenses too. Some of these systems are valued in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars per unit. So, when Ukraine wipes out a radar or air defense system, for example, Russia can suddenly find itself with a gigantic gap in its military budget. And if it wants to remain competitive and aggressive on the battlefields up and down the extensive front lines, it has to fill that gap, and the countless others that emerge as Ukraine's operators bombard its assets and wipe high-value targets off the map. This isn't sustainable. Even a major economy like Russia can't simply just keep on churning out incredibly expensive military hardware forever and ever, replacing and repairing costly damages, paying ever higher military salaries, and funding a war that's far closer to a stalemate than any sort of rampaging Russian victory. Then, there are all the Ukrainian drone and missile attacks on oil infrastructure, which have been the catalyst for even more economic chaos and one of the worst fuel crises the Russian Federation has seen in its entire history. The second big factor behind the arms industry's inevitable decline is the effect of sanctions. Sanctions were quickly imposed on Russia almost immediately after the invasion began, and they've become progressively worse over time, with Russian banks, businesses, elites, and even the general population gradually cut off from the world's financial services and punished for their involvement in a brutal, bloody, and entirely needless conflict. At first, thanks to its preparatory effects prior to the invasion, Russia and its industries, especially the defense industry, were able to survive these sanctions relatively unscathed. But bit by bit, they've started to take their toll, and the arms industry is seriously feeling the heat as more recent waves of sanctions make it increasingly difficult for Russian defense businesses to import the vital technologies and components they need to proceed with their weapons and defense development projects. In other words, many of these firms are finding that they're simply not able to work on things like AI-powered drones and cutting-edge air defenses because so many countries around the world are refusing to sell to them. And Russia may be a vast land with plenty of natural resources of its own, but just like any other country, it can't make everything domestically. It has to have external partners to assist it, but if those partners start closing their doors and cutting off communications, many of Russia's defense companies will have nowhere left to turn. What's more, this is one problem that Russia can't avoid, because not only are sanctions persisting, but they're also becoming progressively worse over time. On the night of October 23, 2025, for instance, the US Treasury Department announced yet another wave of sanctions against Russia, aimed at pressuring Putin to negotiate a peace deal. The new sanctions focus specifically on Russia's oil industry, which naturally has close connections to the military-industrial complex, since oil and fuel are so vital for powering the machines that make Russia's weapons and military hardware, as well as keeping that hardware up and running on the battlefield. Russian oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil are two of the main targets of this sanctions package, as well as many of their small subsidiaries, with all of the US-based assets and property interests of these companies completely frozen. In addition, any foreign financial institutions conducting significant transactions with the sanctioned firms risk facing secondary sanctions of their own. The EU too is ramping up the pressure on Russia, releasing wave after wave of sanctions packages, most often focused on the all-important energy sector that is seen by many as the lifeblood of both the Russian economy and its war machine. Vladimir Putin, as always, has displayed defiance, claiming that new sanctions will have little impact on his economy, but he's made similar claims in the past, and the facts are clear for all to see. The third reason for Russia's arms industry collapse is also linked to other countries, as fewer and fewer of them are investing heavily in Russian equipment. The country has always been one of the big go-to sources for tanks, armored vehicles, fighter jets, and other military systems in the past, building a reputation among many nations, particularly those across Asia, for providing some of the strongest hardware at fair prices. Now, however, those same countries are starting to see through the Russian facade. They, like everyone else around the world, read the news and see the headlines about Russian tanks being blown up on the battlefields of Ukraine and its armored vehicles failing to make a dent in Kyiv's defensive lines. They see artillery systems failing, air defenses proving worthless against even the cheapest and most basic of drones, and radars being wiped out without warning. And many are starting to wonder why they'd want to spend inordinate amounts of money on such weak and feeble systems when they could instead find better alternatives elsewhere or even try to make their own. India, for example, which happens to be the 5th biggest military spender in the world, has historically been a huge buyer of Russian arms. However, it's starting to shift away from Kremlin imports, preferring instead to focus on its burgeoning Made in India initiative, which emphasizes greater domestic production of weaponry and defenses, with less reliance on imported goods. And even when India does decide to import from other nations, it's starting to overlook Russia in favor of other countries. In October 2024, for example, it made a deal with the US to buy some Reaper drones, and its defense minister, Rajnath Singh, recently announced that close to 70% of Indian defense equipment used to be imported. Now, that same amount is being made domestically, and that means far less cash is being funneled from New Delhi to Moscow. And India isn't the only nation backing away from Russian arms agreements. Vietnam, which almost built its entire army on Soviet equipment several decades ago, is starting to pivot towards buying systems from America, like the C-130J Super Hercules transport aircraft and F-16 fighter jets, rather than wasting its funds on low-grade Russian hardware that's proven utterly ineffective in Ukraine. The statistics behind this decline are astonishing. In 2021, Russia exported $14.6 billion worth of arms. By 2024, that had dropped below $1 billion. In 2019, it had 31 active weapons buyers. By 2024, that figure had fallen to 12, and it's likely to drop even further. Reason number 4 for the arms industry's decline is labor shortages. Russia is facing a veritable labor crisis brought about almost entirely by the war. Around 1 million Russians have reportedly left the country since the conflict began, including many of its brightest minds and young graduates who could have contributed greatly in fields like military development and engineering. Countless more people have either been recruited or forcefully drafted to join the war effort, where many have been killed or wounded and may never be fit to return to work. Those left behind in Russia are simply not available in sufficient quantities to meet the insatiable needs of the military-industrial complex. A statement from the Russian parliament itself in 2024 acknowledged that the country's defense industry was lacking 400,000 workers, and with the Russian military continuing to suffer heavy losses and recruit tens of thousands more people each month to replace those that were killed or wounded, this issue isn't going away. In response, defense companies have introduced various new initiatives in a desperate attempt to meet demand. Many facilities run around the clock, with workers suffering through grueling 12-hour shifts and 6-day work weeks. Other companies have resorted to more drastic measures, using inmates from local prisons to fill staffing gaps or importing workers from North Korea. Several hundred women have also been flown in from Central and West Africa to work in facilities like the Alabuga drone factory. The longer the war goes on, the worse these issues will become, and Russia is inevitably running out of truly trained, skilled, experienced people to fill the roles that need filling across its vast arms industry. With increasingly unskilled and overworked individuals being forced to fill in, mistakes and even disasters are almost inevitable. The 5th and final reason comes down to one word: simplification. Because of the aforementioned problems, like difficulties finding import and export partners, plus the crippling effect of sanctions, many Russian defense firms simply aren't able to pursue high-end futuristic military projects and work on developing brand new systems. Instead, they're mostly stuck making simple Soviet-era technology and low-quality goods in large quantities. As a Chatham House report explained, production will likely have to be simplified and slowed over the coming years. While Russia will be forced to accept reduced quality of output, and will suffer from innovation stagnation in its technological research and development. The problem here is that industries won't survive if they simply sit still and stagnate. They need to evolve, to grow, to push their boundaries and pass their limits. And this is especially true in the field of defense, which is always evolving and changing with the times. The Kremlin's defense companies are going to find it increasingly difficult to innovate, and many of the smaller companies may be forced to fold as a result. This too will harm the arms industry's overall output, and the Russian forces along the front lines will continue to receive the same mediocre equipment they've been using for years, while Ukraine instead unveils bigger and better domestic weapons while also receiving more advanced arms from its allies too. In short, the problems facing Russia's arms industry aren't merely a question of economics. They're also directly linked to the Kremlin's prospects of winning this war, and as the industry deteriorates, those prospects become increasingly grim. Now, you can learn more about how sanctions and corruption on the inside are also contributing to the ongoing collapse of Russia's military industry in this video. Or for a bigger and broader look at how this war is starting to spiral widely out of control from the Kremlin's point of view, watch this video, which looks at how Ukraine's valiant defenders are using covert missions, secret strategies, and precision strikes deep behind enemy lines to deal untold damage to Russia from within. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more informative, insightful, and up-to-date videos on the war in Ukraine and other important military news from around the globe.